All right, in this video, we're going to talk about how some of the processes we've talked about with evolution, how they could lead to the formation of new species. So we're going to talk about how one species may become two or more species, or the process of speciation. So Darwin never really looked at where did new species come from. He only addressed what happens to the species that are here and how do they change or how do they evolve to become better adapted to the environments that they live in. So what is a species first? So you can see we've got different uh, types of birds here. We've got people with different races. The birds look different, they're different species, but the people obviously look different, but they're the same species. So what makes them different? Well, the birds have different songs and different behaviors that prevent interbreeding. So there's a biological species concept. It was first defined by Ernest Mayr. Basically, species would be a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So the biological species concept deals with reproduction. Can they interbreed and produce viable and fertile offspring? So how and why do new species originate? Species are created by a series of evolutionary processes. The population becomes isolated for some reason. You can see in the picture the pond has split into two separate pools in one or in the other. So again, something has to isolate members of the population into different groups. Could be geographic isolation, like in the first picture on the left there. Could be reproductive isolation that's going on in the second picture there. And then separation by itself isn't enough to create new species, but there has to be different selective pressures in the groups that cause them to evolve independently to the point where they are no longer able to reproduce. So you have allopatric isolation, where you have physical separation, geographical separation, and sympatric. They still live in the same area, but something else is separating them. So we have pre and post reproductive barriers to reproduction. These are things that are obstacles to mating or to fertilization if mating occurs. So this basically things that prevent a fertilized egg from forming and developing. So geographical isolation is one. They can't get to each other, they can't mate. Ecological isolation, temporal, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic isolation. So geographical isolation. So you have these two species of chipmunks that live in different areas of the Grand Canyon, separated by the canyon and the river itself. The Harris antelope squirrels inhabit the canyon's south rim. On the north rim, white-tailed antelope squirrels, and again, look similar, different species, they don't interbreed. So this is an example of allopatric speciation, allo meaning different or other, country speciation. Ecological isolation, species occur in the same region but occupy different habitats, so they rarely encounter each other. They are reproductively isolated. There's two species of garter snakes that live in the same area. One typically lives in the water, the other is terrestrial. They don't really encounter each other, so they are isolated even though there's not a physical barrier. Lions and tigers could hybridize, but they live in different habitats. Lions live in the grasslands, tigers live in rainforests. Temporal is timing. Species breed during different times of the year, different mating seasons, different years, cannot mix gametes. So again, reproductive isolation. This is sympatric speciation, same country. Two types of skunks, they overlap, but one mates in the winter, one mates in the summer, so they don't ever reproduce. Behavioral, basically what types of courtship rituals do these animals do, like the blue-footed booby mates only after a courtship display unique to their species. So different species have different unique behavioral patterns and rituals that isolate them reproductively. They identify them as being members of the species. They attract mates of the same species, mating calls, courtship rituals, and so on. Recognizing your own species. Females and males recognize a member of their species because of specific courtship displays, fireflies using the light for displays, different songs, different sounds that they produce. Again, mechanical isolation. Morphological, structural differences prevent sexual mating. The male and female parts may not fit together. With plants, the pollinators of one plant may not be able to pollinate different species of plants because of the structure of the flower. Again, so you don't get cross-pollination, things like that. Mechanical isolation in animals, the male and female sex organs don't fit together, prevents the transfer of sperm. So again, can't produce offspring. Gametic isolation. Sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another. Oftentimes there's a process where the egg has to bind to receptors, or has receptors that bind with the sperm, but only of the right species. So this is a kind of a biochemical or chemical incompatibility where the sperm can't survive in that female reproductive tract. And then we have post-reproductive barriers. Hybrid offspring can maybe form, they may be viable, but they're not fertile. So you have reduced hybrid viability where the hybrids don't survive very well, if at all. Reduced hybrid fertility where they reproduce, but they're not able to produce their own sperm and egg. Or hybrid breakdown where they just don't survive. So genes of different parents species may interact and impair the hybrid's development. Number one, typically the chromosome numbers don't match up. So we have hybrids that form, but they have problems, they're frail, they typically don't live long enough to reproduce. They may survive, but oftentimes they're sterile. Again, this has more to do with the chromosome number and structure, so meiosis doesn't work right to produce normal gametes. So you take a horse and a mule and cross them, you get a donkey. Mules are very vigorous, they're very strong, they're bred for their strength, but they can't make more mules. The only way to make more mules is to breed a horse and a donkey. So again, horses 64 chromosomes, donkeys 62, so there's not a matching number of chromosomes. Mules have 63, one extra. Hybrid breakdown. Hybrids may be fertile and viable in the first generation, but when they mate, offspring over generation after generation become febile or sterile or both. So one of the questions has always been, one of the problems kind of had been with the fossil record was we don't see a lot of these so-called transitional forms or transitional species. And if evolution was this very slow, gradual process, we would expect to find more. So the scientists began to look at the data that they had, and they came up with a better explanation for the rate of speciation for some species. So it's not that one theory is right and one is wrong. It's that depending on the species, one may be correct for this organism, but the other theory is correct for another. So does speciation happen gradually or rapidly? And again, when we use these terms, these are relative terms. On the evolutionary timescale, rapidly is not a couple of years, a couple hundred years even. So gradualism was proposed by Darwin. Slow, steady change. Linnell also worked with it. Punctuated equilibrium, a newer theory, was first published by Stephen Jay Gould. Niles Eldridge also worked on that. And they've come with the idea where you have long periods of stasis where there's not a lot of evolution change because the environment's pretty stable. And then the environment changes and we get this rapid burst of evolution. This is kind of what we would expect with the gradualism model. Big changes occur as accumulation of many small ones adding together. Punctuated equilibrium, rapid bursts of change, long periods of stasis or no change. Species undergo rapid change when they first bud from the parent population. Just a little information about Gould. Some of the books that he's written here on evolution. So one of the misconceptions about evolution is it's goal-oriented. It's driven towards the perfect fit for that environment. And remember, the basis of evolution is mutation, which is random. So you can't have random mutation be goal-oriented. So an evolutionary trend does not mean that evolution is goal-oriented. It means that in a fairly stable environment, species are going to become more and more adapted to that environment. But there is still random chance involved. For instance, with mating, if you're a peacock, having these big, giant, flashy feathers is really good for attracting a mate, but not always great for survival from predators. So maybe it's better to say evolution, not survival of the fittest, but rather survival of the good enough.